The most important part of dance is music. So now let us listen to the music and identify the beats.
1, 2.
Wait, so the microphone? Hello? Okay, the microphone should be on.
That was too soft.
I'm gonna be so in the brain. So my stream should be up on spoiler alerts. The ride never ended. Woo! Imagine. I don't know, hopefully you can guys. How's that work? Still a little too loud for my liking, but I will take what I can get. They're gonna set up. No, I probably should have set this all up prior. Probably would have been better foreshadowed if I don't mind. But now, after already speaking, I'll give a bit of a lip service if you catch my drift. Keeps the attention of anybody listening. You can't let the ball drop if you know what I mean. It's like that rule in basketball. And if you hold the ball, take too many steps, you catch. What am I? Ande. Ito Mateo. Signing up this thing. I'm actually gonna try to go through the whole video. So the reason why I called this stream "The Ride Never Ends" was primarily for the fact that I'm trying to tie this in with what we're seeing play out. So a lot of people don't understand why we're seeing the current level of medical tyranny that we're currently watching. To some people, it's just kind of like, oh, this is coming out of left field. This makes no sense. Or people would like to obfuscate. It's not people, it's just history. Nobody's been taught that. There have been a variety of different events throughout American history since the since the late 1800s. There have been a variety of movements that have indiscriminately, in a weird sense, genocided a bunch of people. And it's always been through kind of like top-down government structures that a lot of this has happened. And so the video that I found, which I should still... Let's set that up correctly. Nope, I didn't. Put it to the wrong browser. It's better if I do this now, not later, when this could go all terribly wrong. Do something I'm not supposed to necessarily show on the screen, and then, you know, the channel gets kiboshed, and then I'm left out of a platform. Let me see. Do it. Bada bing, bada boom. I think I did this right. Okay, that makes total sense. Why? Yes. I'm a bit of a stiffler for the aesthetic, if you know what I mean. Oh no, what is this? Oh no. See what I'm saying? This is why I should set these things up before, not later. Then things go wrong. Now I do not know what was shown on screen. This weird ass song. I skipped that before. All this goes terribly wrong. So, where was I? Speaking about the American eugenics programs that, actually I didn't even say that yet. So, because I'm trying to explain that. I'm gonna just go back to the corner that I was in. Fix the camera a bit later. Hold on. I'm gonna just fix it right now. Yay. Okay. I think that fixed. No, it didn't? Okay. I'm a bit special. Guess that works enough for me. I don't really care. So yeah, I should probably show this on the screen though. So this guy, he's an author to a variety of books that will be listed in the thing in that like title header. He's going to speak about his current book that he released during this year, which is 2003. I don't know if I'll get to it, if I might skip it because I'm gonna skim through this video. But he mentions that a lot of the people that actually helped him out during his period of doing all this research into figuring out, all of the dealings he had to kind of go through with sourcing a lot of, because he wanted to get primary resources. He didn't want to have footnotes that were quotes. He wanted to get really definitive. And not only that, he inquired a lot of other people to join his research into creating his book. So this is just a drop in the pool of what could be demonstrated and shown into understanding why we're seeing Bill Gates and the WHO and a variety of these institutions that have this authority over our bodily functions. And there's reasons to it. There's reasons why, like some people, they're whatever. There's the conspiracy theory that says there's a group of people that are trying to kill everyone else. And well, this guy wrote a book about how 30% of the population of America, right? The very top wealthy people of America were very much eugenicists. They all supported this. Like, this is not new. This is a deeply rooted thing in American culture. And this was at the this was at the turn of the century. Like literally at the end of the 1800s. So a lot of what happened during these fundamental periods of time actually led and pioneered how humanity, thus from that point on, developed. And it's kind of why it's amazing that I found this video. But actually, let's get into it. Oh, hold on.
Good. Now, I'd like to tell you that I'm going to describe what is a 600-page book with 1,500 footnotes. I'm going to summarize as best I can. Most of the information is in the book itself. As I said, I'm happy to be here, but none of you are going to be happy to hear what I have to say. It's not good news. You're going to get angry.
None of you are going to be happy that this information is being put before you. The fact that I'm going to make a video about this is going to make nobody happy. None of my friends, people who personally know me, will look at this and will probably refuse to look at it, or even refuse to buy the book, debate it to any meaningful quality, because they are people who believe that they are exempt from this rule. But it's like, no, you're only merely creating the rule because you eventually will fall, right? When you think you're the exception, just wait your turn. Just wait your turn. Eventually, you'll get your turn.
Angry. You're going to be shocked. And at the end of my discussion, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. First of all, we are talking about eugenics. Now, most people are familiar with Nazi eugenics. This was Hitler's idea for a master race. But very few people are aware that the idea originated not in Nazi Germany, but in the United States 2 to 3 years before Hitler, 2 to 3 decades before Hitler came to power.
2 to 3 decades. The fundamental philosophy behind genetics was largely developed here in America by Darwin's cousin. Just look up the American Eugenics Society. But I digress on that.
As American eugenicists went on a campaign to create a white master Nordic race, blonde and blue-eyed. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about the idea of eugenics. Eugenics itself started in Victorian England. There was a scientist, his name was Francis Galton, the cousin of Darwin, Charles Darwin. And this guy, Galton, had these ideas that if talented, skilled, and wealthy people married other talented, skilled, and wealthy people, they would have talented, skilled, and wealthy children. And he thought by this method, we could improve society. He tried to put a number on this. He tried to find a pattern in this because he himself, of course, was...
Like, literally, people will be like, oh, dude, you're reading too much into the message. You're looking too much into this, and you're drawing the conclusions that don't necessarily add up, and da-da-da. I've had a lot of these allegations thrown at me. Meanwhile, a lot of the fundamental science that people are currently susceptible to, the one that they digest, whatever we want to call this, a lot of these people will then suck at the teat of the scientific institutions that created these ideas. But who created these ideas? Why were these ideas perpetuated, put forth? Why are these ideas being continued to be pushed today? And you'll find out that a lot of the scientists he's talking about are the reason why biology is understood the way it is. But that's a whole other subject. Back to this.
He's a seeker of patterns. He was actually the inventor of fingerprints. Actually, God invented fingerprints, but he was the inventor of the method of identifying and classifying fingerprints. He was the inventor of various fashions of meteorology and barometric readings. And so he tried to find a way to quantify the idea of a good marriage. And he came up with this term from the Greek that he invented, eugenics, meaning good life or good birth. These ideas were imported into the United States at the turn of the last century, meaning in the early 1900s. Now, what was that time like? It was a time of great racial, ethnic, and demographic upheaval and conflict. What did we have? We had millions of Jews coming in from the East, from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from Poland. We had millions of blacks in the post-Reconstruction and post-Civil War era who were being integrated into United States society. India.
Right? You always have to build an understanding of the landscape of the time period that you're talking about, right? Because these were the actions of very few men. Very few men. And you'll find out that these people actually didn't give a fuck about anybody who didn't participate in the Civil War or was of that era. They didn't care about you. They didn't care about your life. They didn't consider you American if you weren't there. So it gave people this absolution of special boy powers that allowed them to pass all of this legislation. And by the way, this was deeply rooted, right? Like, he's going to get into it, but I'm just saying, you got to build an understanding of the landscape of what we're thinking about. Who were the people? Why were these decisions made? Why did these men come to these conclusions?
Indians were being integrated into United States society. Millions of Asians had come in from the West as as indentured laborers, and millions of Mexicans were now in U.S. territory as a result of Mexican-American wars, in which we took over a great amount of Mexican territory. And there were a bunch of white guys, some scientists, some wealthy people, men of privilege, people whose names most people don't know, names like Charles Davenport and Harry Laughlin, and they wanted it the way it was. They wanted it the way it was when their fathers were running the country. And of course,
I want to go back there. Can I go back there? I want to go back to the good old times. Good old times when none of these folk were here. And it goes into this aspect of, like, you'll always have these people that will come to these broad-stroked conclusions. And they will bend the truth. They will mend whatever they can find in order to justify. Well, it's not really to justify. It's merely a facade to sell to the public, so the public doesn't actually lash out in a very violent way. And they're learning, right? These people who are making these decisions are learning from history, because a lot of them had to be educated in whatever they had to be well versed in whatever they needed to be, right? Politicians. Or at least maintain their power, affluence. There's a whole lot that I'm not, like, quantifying, but
of course, when we say the 20th century, we ask ourselves, who is running the 20th century? The 20th century was being run by guys from the Civil War, just as our 21st century is being run by guys in the post-Vietnam era. And these guys from the post-Civil War period brought all their racist baggage into the 20th century with them. They considered themselves reformers. They considered themselves liberals, progressives, and
oh no, those were different times. Those were different times. That doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. And it's just like, no. There's a reason why the Democrats are the party of, what was it, the party of whites? Or something along the lines? Because when you think about it, it still is the party of whites. Because all white people do is virtue signal. And when you come down to understanding what this man's about to lay down as an argument, if these programs did happen here in America, that means any white person who survived any of those weeding out of genetics, that means you were allowed to live because you were subservient. You were literally the best and most efficient worker bee. It's kind of a very scary thought to think about, but it's
Utopians. And their idea of a utopia was a world in which no one would exist who did not resemble themselves. This all came at a time when Mendel's principles of heredity had been rediscovered and proliferated in the United States. Now, just to refresh you on Mendel's principles of heredity, this is where the peas, there's a blemished pea and a non-blemished pea, and the next generation, some are blemished and some are not. These men thought that the same principles that guided peas guided the development and generations of human life. And they believed that poverty was a genetic trait, criminality, chastity, morality. So, in other words, you weren't born into poverty. Poverty was born into you. And
original sin. This is literally, like, there were, I don't even know how long the debate of original sin actually existed, right? Because I first came across it when I was looking at monks debate amongst each other. I can't remember what it was, but it had to do with a lot of the crusades that happened in Latin America. But there were debates amongst what was original sin, like what constituted the definition of having a soul. And in this case, you just had people who didn't care. They just wanted things the way they used to be, like the good old days. But in reality, these people who are making these decisions are obfuscating the fact of how did the Civil War came to be? Why were these decisions made? Who had a hand in this? Pro bono, who benefited? And there's always this lack of, like, I don't know, you know.
And the best way to get rid of poverty and improve the world was to get rid of the people who had this genetic trait. As far as they were concerned, it didn't matter if you took an African, put him in a white toga, taught him to read Latin, and put him in Italy. That did not make him a Roman. That's exactly the type of language that they used. So it was not the character of your family. It was not your wealth. It was not your position or your education. What mattered was whether you were of defective ancestry, racially unacceptable, eugenically unacceptable, and whether your progeny would create more defective individuals for society. And this is what they wanted to get rid of. They believed, that you could breed a better human being in the same way that you could breed a better herd of cattle, a field of wheat, an ear of corn. And consequently, the government agency that put these guys together was the U.S. Department of Agriculture, because they wanted to breed a better species of man also. So these guys obtained immense amounts of corporate philanthropy to back their ideas. I'm talking here about corporate philanthropy engaged in ethnic cleansing. The Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Harriman Railroad fortune, pouring the equivalent of millions into the coffers of these gentlemen to
Doesn't that sound like something? Doesn't that sound like something oddly similar that's going on right now? Doesn't that sound like verbatim what happened in a certain country that's being taken over by Russia? Right? With the way that they were funded, both paramilitarily, pharmaceutically, privately, through defense funds, taxpayer dollars. Right? And that's just the country that's currently losing itself between Russia and European interest. Then, if you look at what's going on the inverse side of things, when we're looking at a certain dweeb with a certain repertoire for being a very kind-hearted individual for his philanthropy work, and you look at their investments, and you look at the way they've maintained themselves, and you look at their agenda, right? You've begun to understand why they're making the decisions that they're making, why they're I don't know how to say it, but why they're doing what they're doing is all I'm saying. Is you begin to understand who were their dads, who were their grandfathers, what was, you know what I'm saying? What was the ideology passed down from one generation to the next that basically allowed them morally obfuscating these rules in their own head in order for them to justify their own decisions. But that's a whole other issue, because in reality, it's like, I don't know. Let's just keep going.
Establish research facilities on Long Island and elsewhere that would study how best to eliminate all of the defective, unwanted, unfit, and unacceptable types of human beings that they considered eugenically out of bounds. Now, what were some of their methods that they wanted? The first method that they thought about, one of the first, was gas chambers, public gas chambers. Now, remember, we're talking about the first 20 years of the 20th century, and they thought that the best idea was to march these guys into public gas chambers in groups, organized on a township or a county or a village basis, and within a period of time, these guys...
In America. Just keep that in mind. This all happened in America. This didn't happen in Europe. This didn't happen anywhere else, right? Because a lot of the research, right, research and development, a lot of the research and development happened here in America. Nowhere else. Nowhere else. Everything that was researched, finely tuned, it gets even better. I'm just going to wait for it.
would disappear. But they concluded that our society was not ready for gas chambers. Even still, some individuals freelanced. For instance, there were mental hospitals in Illinois, one in particular that I describe in the book in Lincoln, Illinois, who fed their new patients milk from tubercular cows. And in so doing, infected these new patients, and then they allowed them to sleep in open dormitories to cross-infect the others. And by this method, they would have a 30 to 40% death rate of new patients. And tuberculosis, of course, was, in that era, as bad, if not worse, than AIDS is today. There were other...
Did you hear that? I wonder, was there ever like something that happened recently where they would infect or put people that they knew would be infected in the presence of other people that, got infected? Like, did that ever happen within the last... Oh, it happened within... Oh, just 2 years ago. Oh. What ended up happening? Oh. The same results he just said. Oh, okay. I'm just, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's almost like you just learn things from history.
Doctors who would leave newborn infants who were defective or deformed, lying without any help or nutrition on the delivery table. One in particular gained national notoriety. He was called the Black Stork. He was such a hero of the eugenics movement. They actually made a movie about this guy, which you could see at the corner cinema for 25 cents or sometimes a nickel. But in the main...
Making idols out of these crazy people in order for the rest of the public to idolize them. But I wonder, like, did the public know? Were they for this? He actually says it, and no, they weren't.
They believed that youth...
Oh yeah, the book is called War Against the Weak. War Against the Weak. I need to buy this book.
Would not achieve what they wanted to achieve. And so instead, they opted for forced surgical sterilization. And they got it. They obtained legislation in 27 states that forcibly sterilized some 60,000 Americans.
I find myself in a bit of a silence because it's literally... It's almost like they don't innovate the playbook. It's almost like they're like, just keep running it. They don't care. They took it. We got the numbers we wanted. There's already this many people that won't even get to have kids, this and that. Like, we've already handled them. We're gonna wipe them out of here. I don't know. Some people just don't learn. And my favorite part about this is, like, people I know personally, I was gonna call them N-words, my N-words, right? But I can't call them that because they're all white. So I actually stopped myself because I thought it would be funny, right? I'm calling my homies who I know, who are white, who are people who consider themselves of this master race. They have these eugenic principles, right? These ancient American eugenic principles. If anything right, and it's funny, right? I can make this joke now that I'm thinking about it. But if there's one American cultural principle that they've maintained over 200 years, it's at least eugenicism. I'm just saying. These people just haven't changed. And they like to, right? I've heard so many blanket statements come out of their mouth. Like, one of my favorite statements that was ever said to me is like, oh, like, you know what? Like, I think of you like white. That's why I'm always okay around you. And, you know, I'm just, he didn't realize it right then and there until somebody else brought it up to him. Like, do you not realize how fucked up what you just said was? And I knew, but at the same time, I understand that, like, I don't know, dog. Every time I encounter these situations, I just think of Mr. T in the back of my head. I pity the white fool. Like, for real. Like, I pity the white fool. Because they've been put in their little glass, you know, what do you call those? The snow globey things you shake, right? Like, they live in a very nice little petri dish. They're not allowed to speak with anybody. They're not allowed to have any meaningful interaction with any other culture. Like, all of the propaganda is kind of like designed for them to lull them into this fantasy-like lifestyle state. And a lot of the culture has been perpetuated using their image, using their face, using their likeness without realizing all of the gruesome history that's been put before them. Because the people who suffered the most out of all this were them. Literally were them. Because he has a quote that he'll eventually say where 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And that means they killed 3 generations of people here in America. So if you are white and you think you survived out of the virtue of X, Y, or Z, I'm sorry, but you survived out of the virtue of fitting a certain criteria that these eugenicists had.
In addition to forced surgical sterilization, there was marriage restriction, marriage annulment. If they didn't like who you were married, they unmarried you. And of course, there was the effort to create concentration camps, which they called farms or colonies, for those who were feeble-minded, so-called feeble-minded, or racially unacceptable. They started out by calling these colonies for the feeble-minded. There were several in New Jersey, in Massachusetts, and eventually hundreds of thousands of individuals were incarcerated, and then
the feeble-minded, dude. They had concentration camps for the feeble-minded. What does that even mean?
Forcibly sterilized because they were deemed to be unfit. Now, what kind of people are we talking about who are unfit? We're talking about Southern Italians. We're talking,
you know, and when you think about it, like, it wouldn't be that hard to make a stretch of, oh, what do you mean you didn't survive your what do you mean you didn't survive your government mandated vaccine? What are you, some punk B, dude? What the fuck, dude? You got some weak ass genes, fool. If that little puny shot got, like, I could just imagine a skit that's like that, of somebody with just like all the jabs, right? And they're just like, what do you mean, you punk bitch? Your genetics didn't survive all that poison? Pfft, you're weak. I could just totally imagine a skit like that. Either way.
Talking about Eastern European Jews, we're talking about blacks, Indians, we're talking about Asians, and we're talking about white guys with brown hair. They believe that white guys with brown hair, the hillbillies, the hill folk, many of which were in these parts of Tennessee, were basically bastardizations and mongrelizations of the white Nordic ideal that they lionized. In fact, the state of Virginia,
right, the ideal they had in their mind,
published a booklet entitled Mongrel Virginians, about these mongrel human beings. And they came up with a number of ideas on how
mongrel Virginians. So if you live in Virginia and you survived, let me know how's it like? How's it like being a white mongrel? Like, I kind of want to understand what it's like to be a discriminated figure against the occulted few, you know what I'm saying? Like, we can make like a very interesting document being retarded
to identify these people. And one of them was the alpha test and the beta test. It was a mental measurement test. And this mental measurement test might ask a Southern Italian who knew every opera and aria about a Broadway musical. He'd come into Ellis Island, they'd ask him a question about Broadway musicals. You might get a black guy from the farm who had never been to a big city, and they would ask him something about a Cosmopolitan magazine. You might get a Baptist kid from rural America who would, of course, never smoked. They'd ask him about tobacco ads. They would ask people about tennis rackets who didn't even know what tennis was. And by this methodology, they were able to conclude that 70 to 80% of the Jews were morons, 70 to 80% of the blacks were morons, and these people were worthy of sterilization so that they could not perpetuate their kind. This test...
Literally, you are moving the goalpost. You are asking questions that you know that these people have no idea what the fuck you're asking them, and you're setting them up for failure. And you know, it's funny, I said this last night in the stream, where people are literally set up for failure. They're given two choices. What do you want? Fast food? Or like, do you want to take the time, learn how to cook, go through the entire process, have to clean, right? They make it seem like cooking a meal for yourself is literally a chore, just too much work, that you'll actually rather go for the fast food, when in reality, they're laughing at you. They're laughing at the fact that you'd rather eat the poison and not know better, because they know that if they were to do the exact same test in a lab with rats, what would the rats do? The rats wouldn't actually eat the fast food. So to them, to these people who are eugenicists, people who see themselves above the ordinary confinements of what humanity is, they laugh at us because they set up these false paradigms where they know we're going to make the wrong decisions, where they know we are failures, or at least they think. Everyone, right? Because you don't know who these people are. The fact that you don't go to their schools, the fact that you don't shop at their stores, the fact that you don't live or maintain lifestyles like they do, goes to show that they are more than willing to allow us to live these poisonous lives. But either way, I'm getting way off topic.
Test, the alpha and beta test, was ultimately evolved into something we know today as the IQ test. It's the same basic test, but it's evolved. Now, there were so many things that were upside down about this. The ophthalmologists of America, if you can possibly believe this, went on a national crusade to identify everybody with a vision problem, find their entire family, round them up, put them in concentration camps, and forcibly sterilize them as a way to improve vision in America. There's a whole chapter about that. They actually took the...
I forgot that I muted this. But vision. They rounded everyone up in America just because they wanted more people with 20/20 vision. Just because... I don't even know. I'm just... And keep in mind, these were Americans. He's not even classifying what race they were, this or that. Right? That means if they wanted to actually promote more of these people that had better eye vision, guess what that means? Guess what group of people they were? But no, I'm special. No, they wouldn't do anything to me. Oh man, I always laugh at these people.
The first step with a bill entered into the New York legislature, although this bill was defeated. Although these laws were in 27 states, there were many people who felt that this was unconstitutional, and so there was a kind of a go-slow approach. And so a fraudulent collusive lawsuit was created in Virginia for the purpose of making eugenics a test case. The state of Virginia wanted to sterilize the mother, the daughter, and the granddaughter of one family. It was a famous case, Carrie Buck, her mother, and her daughter. So the state of Virginia colluded with the court-appointed attorneys for Carrie Buck, and
Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Literally, the state, an entire state decided to collude with the lawyers of somebody just to sterilize them. A single person. All because it set us, right? All because it sets precedent.
Wound a fraudulent appeal right up through the Supreme Court, and Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a staunch eugenicist, ruled for the majority that it is better for all the world, that's a quote, that these 3 generations be sterilized. Quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And in so doing, opened the floodgates. And ultimately, as I said, some 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized, many without even knowing it. Some they...
Right? So you weren't even allowed to know if you were sterilized or not. You probably could have lived your entire life, and you probably wouldn't even never known. You probably just thought that you just had a dick that didn't work. But nope. It's because you were just one of those Americans that didn't. And here's what's funny, right? He brings up somewhere along later that the only reason why America didn't successfully do this is because they couldn't actually keep track of all of the people that were here in America. And because of that, it became increasingly more difficult for them to be able to pinpoint what races to call. Either way, let's move on.
They said, we're voluntarily sterilized. They would get some girl from the hills of Virginia or Kentucky or Tennessee, and they would ask her, hi, honey, do you like the movies? Do you like the cartoons? She'd say, yeah, I do. Do you mind if we do something to help out your health? She'd say, sure. And they say, fine, voluntary sterilization. Ultimately, this was not only national policy enshrined in legislation in 27 states, it became the law of the land. And backing it up was fake science and fake academics from the highest corridors of Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Princeton. It was the greatest of our universities.
Why would they lie? Why would these scientists lie to us? Like, these people were nice. There's no way they would lie to us, man. Like, there's no way that ideologically these people would be driven to such extremes, man. No way, man. These people were nice, kind-hearted people, man. Like, there's no way. I could just imagine the levels. Just imagining the levels of, like, hoops. Because, you know, I can vividly remember, like, certain stances that people took that I argued with. So I can actually think in my head, just the cogs turning in their heads of them thinking that, like, no, you're wrong. I'm an exception. There's no way this would happen to me. There's absolutely no way that these people would do anything wrong to me, right? And it's just like, the way that this works is that they have to make you believe it. Because if you knew the truth, you wouldn't make the decision.
Universities that provided the sham science to back up these racists. Now, just so you understand, we are not talking about a bunch of guys running around a pickup truck with a Confederate flag behind them and a gun rack in the back window. We're talking about the brightest and the best, the elite, about the greatest America had to offer. And all these laws were endorsed and debated by 27 legislatures in 27 states. This was not an isolated matter. This was not a matter that never went into to implementation. It was a national attempt to engage in ethnic cleansing, and it was supported by corporate philanthropy. Now, it wasn't enough to do this in the United States. These guys...
And this was at the late 1800s. Literally, you had a government effort colluding with corporate sponsorship in order to bring all this about. But no, you're not allowed to talk about that. No. Eugenicism is a good thing. Hitler was a good guy. I swear, dude. I swear, man. Like, that's why we always post these memes on the forums, dude. And it's just like, all of this, you've literally been psyoped by his grandson in order to believe these things. And if you don't know who his grandson is yet, this is one of those moments I would relish forever in life. But that's for other reasons.
The American eugenics movement wanted to do this worldwide. And so the Carnegie Institution began...
Globalism, my boy. You gotta think big, you know what I'm saying?
To sponsor pseudoscientific medical journals, international congresses, and research fellowships around the world, especially in Europe, to proliferate our ideas into other countries. And we did this successfully, getting cohorts of American eugenics to sponsor legislation in Canada, in Belgium, in Scandinavia, and a particular pet project of the American eugenics movement was Germany.
It's almost like they knew where to set it all up. Because if this was at the right, if they had 3 decades, 3 whole decades to plan all this out before they took it over to Europe, and then they started developing their little pet project with all the Germans in order to set up what? World War I and World War II. This was all orchestrated, at least from the way I'm looking at it. From the way I've seen certain groups of people benefit the most out of all of these wars, to see certain dominoes be set up for narratives, like literally narratives for people to live their entire lives on, because it's all based on an identity, a story that creates this blind faith inside of the minds of these citizens that will allow the perpetual hate, that will allow the perpetual playing field for constant war between each other. And people are like, oh, it's because I have the definitive answer here, actually. And it's just like, if that was so true, my question would not ring so true, which is, what constitutes the fall of the empire? Always. Is it the demise of the land and the people? Or is it the right of rulership, the right of trust, the right of governing? Because as it seems now, there's only been one group of people to benefit the most out of everything that's occurred in the last, I don't know, safely say probably the last 1,000 years. And I could say that with conviction, because I know what happened to the Byzantine Empire. I know what they created out of the Roman Catholic Church. And I know why the Reformation happened. Not many people could actually say that. And how the Reformation actually created the playing field for what then thus happened, 200 years later? With every single revolution sparking off? It's been a constant war of an awakening and a sleepening. But anyway.
And they successfully transplanted American ideas of eugenics into Germany into the 20s and ultimately the 30s. And in the 20s, it came to the attention of a guy called Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler studied American eugenics, American eugenic laws, and American eugenic theories, and he conceded openly that he admired them. He admired them. And he took his pre-existing racism, his pre-existing anti-Semitism, and wrapped it in the idea of eugenics to scientize and medicalize his theories, and then switched the word Nordic race with Aryan race to create the Nazi quest for the master race. And he even acknowledged in fan mail to American eugenicists, such as one to Madison Grant, America's chief racist, from the American Museum of Natural History, when he said, "Your book is my Bible." And so...
By the way, he sourced that. So when this live stream is over, you can just go, hit on back, listen to that again, find that letter, go to that museum, and actually read it for yourself. That your book is my Bible. Literal quote from Adolf Hitler. How he's looking towards America and being like, yes, these are great ideas. And he actually implemented them in his own. Then again, I don't know. I have a deep belief about how he was sponsored by American capitalists. So if anyone wanted to use research and development understanding, of course they would use it, right? Notice how the capitalists knew that America, at a time when they wanted to use gas chambers, they knew that the public wasn't ready for it. But if you had the conditions during war, and if you created this very deep-rooted sense of us versus them narrative amongst the people, that seems like very favorable conditions in order to institute some very radical ideas.
I've been writing about the Holocaust for 35 years, and I finally understood what Nazism and the Holocaust was about. I've always said you can document it, but you'll never explain it. But if we listen to the words of Hitler and his inner circle in a common phrase that they used, he said, National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. And so it seems that even more than a war of territorial conquest and economic plunder, this was a eugenic war, a biological war backed up by a genocidal military. And in fact, the Rockefeller Foundation spent millions to build eugenic institutions from the ground up. And one of the institutions that they were building from the ground up was controlled by a guy called Ottmar Freiherr Verschuur. And Verschuur, we might say, was the chief Nazi eugenicist. And Verschuur received grants from Rockefeller. And Verschuur...
My favorite part comes next. When he mentions what happens to him, what happens to his partner, and then thus later the research that they both of these people came to America. Keep that in mind. In the 70s. I wonder what happened during those times. I wonder what happened with human experimentation.
He had an interest in twins. In fact, twin research was the holy grail of research for the eugenics movement. Because with twins, you could unlock the mysteries of defective reproduction. And with twins, you could reveal the secret of multiplication of the master race. And Verschuur had an assistant. And the assistant's name was Josef Mengele. And Verschuur sent Mengele into Auschwitz to finish the program originally started and funded by Rockefeller. And so millions of Jews and Gypsies and other Europeans were unloaded, boxcar after boxcar, into Auschwitz amongst terror and noise. And the one word they each heard twice was the word twins. We want twins. And these twins were gathered and horrible.
Right, the reason why they wanted twins was because they are more predispositioned into having more twins. Yeah, this gets pretty gruesome.
Horrible experiments were done on them. Horrible. They were fused together. Their veins were tied together. Their eyeballs were experimented with. They were given terrible viruses, painful injections in the eyes. And we have spent a half a century trying to understand the unfathomable nightmare experiments of Josef Mengele. But every American eugenicist understood what a Mengele would do. Because every day Mengele worked on his scientific reports, his clinical autopsies, and dispatched them 2 or 3 times each week to his boss, for sure. In fact, after the Holocaust, for sure, was actually welcomed back into the fold of scientific fellowship by his colleagues in California. Now, after the Holocaust, at Nuremberg, eugenics was deemed to be an act of genocide.
Can you imagine? I was like, what the fuck, dude? I live in the state that this fool returned to. And it gets so much worse. And it gets so much worse, right? So the next time people ask me, like, oh, you know, it's your people. That's the reason that California is the way it is with you guys migrating there. And I'm just going to be like, no, not really. I think it had to do with the Nazis that were doing all the drug experiments on your people. And they were also doing the experiments with them trying to poison your mind culturally through music in order to influence you and change your cultural paradigm because you guys were too successfully having families and it was too successful for you guys and they wanted to destroy it in order to sell it to China. So some things needed to change. University needed to get federalized. I can go on. For days, my boy. For days. You ain't ready for me. You ain't ready for my truth bombs.
A crime against humanity, and the Americans went underground, and the Germans on trial quoted the words of Oliver Wendell Holmes in their own defense. They entered the California statutes, and California at all times was the state where 1/2 to 1/3 of all sterilizations took place. And they were found guilty, and then the Americans changed the name of American eugenics to human genetics. Same guys.
Rebrand. It's like literally when I don't know, it's like one of the popular things to do is like set up an LLC, name it yourself, and pay yourself through the LLC. So right, if you get sued or anything happens with the business that you're running, the LLC goes down, not you, because the LLC you were just an employee of this LLC. And the only reason why I know this is because that's how Keemstar found a loophole in a way for him to get back on YouTube after he got banned off of YouTube. He just created a company, then that company made a YouTube channel, and it just so happens that Keemstar works for that company. You know, and then it gets into this whole legal aspect thing. So basically he was using loopholes that other countries are using to run YouTube channels here, right? Because it's a giant loophole, right? If they decide to address this with Keemstar, it would actually patch up a huge amount of loopholes that other entities of the world are using in order to kind of allow themselves into the country to influence the minds of people. That's a completely other issue. But remember, all of this research was fundamentally started somewhere, and people like to obfuscate the fact that oh no, and by people I mean people who go to university. People who considered themselves very, I don't know, like the good boys of high school, right? Like people who assimilated into the system and thought that that's what was supposed to be done, right? Because that's what your parents told you to do. You went to university because that's where the opportunities were supposed to be. But only a very few select people understood that these conveyor belts of life don't necessarily give you what they promise. But that's a whole other discussion.
Same buildings, same philanthropic funds, same laboratories. And over same buildings, changed the name of American eugenics to human genetics. Same guys, same buildings, same philanthropic funds, same laboratories. And over the span of 1 or 2 generations, this science of human genetics has evolved into the modern science of human engineering that we know today, which is peopled by sensitive scientists who are trying to improve mankind and fight disease, and we certainly welcome and invite every genetic miracle that we can have. But now there's a resurgence of the same impulse that caused eugenics in the first place. I'm speaking of new genics.
Right? He's saying, oh man, that was too loud. But he's saying this at a time in 2003. 2003. At the turn when we just had 9/11 happen. And we look at what's going on now with how health is declining, with the way the medical industry has been propped up, with the way children have coincidentally suffered these genetic mutations that have sprung up out of nowhere and only seem to affect very particular countries who have a very peculiar vaccine schedule. It goes to show you that, I don't know, like, they're just finding loopholes in a way for them to give themselves the excuse of offing you.
And this time, it will not be racial dogma and national flags. This time it will be globalization, profit, bottom line, corporate activity that determines who is fit and who is not fit to continue their existence. I give you an example of Burlington Northern Santa Fe engaging in secret testing of the DNA of its employees for the purpose of identifying who has a predisposition to carpal tunnel. The largest employer, and this was just to avoid workman's compensation, the largest employer in Canada canceling the death benefits in an automobile accident of a man of a certain ethnic background. They tracked his background and they realized he's from a group of people who have a ancestral and hereditary blood disease, and they said, well, he wasn't qualified for insurance in the first place. And so,
right? You're just allowing for the excuse of all of these exemptions. And what people don't realize is all of the people who allow for these exemptions will eventually suffer at the hand of fate because they dealt this hand. And you know what? That's why I always found it very ironic that everyone that I ever met during like the 2018 to 2020 period that I was just hopping from Discord server to Discord server, at this point in time, it was just more trying to understand what was going on culturally, in the sense of what was this culture war actually bringing to fruition. And all I kept discovering were just groups of people who weren't aware that the system itself wasn't to be trusted, but they seemed to assume that, oh no, they wouldn't do that to me. I have the blood work, I'm pure blood, I'm this, I'm that. That wouldn't happen to me. And I listen to this stuff and I'm like, nah, doggy, it seems like you fit that criteria because you eat the garbage, you do what they set you up to do. So how does it stop what you're saying? Like, I don't know.
well, now there's a new move to exclude and to to surcharge individuals for insurance, to underemploy them, to non-employ them. Real estate. If you can't get insured and you can't get a job, then you can't get real estate. And legislators are seeing this as the new threat of discrimination in the 21st century. And anti-genetic legislation is already embraced by nations all over the world. And this legislation is in our Congress now, shortly after I speak. The first vote is going to take place in the Senate to adopt anti-genetic discrimination laws to stop gene lining. We all remember what redlining was. Now it will be gene lining.
All right, and he's not wrong. That's literally what we're going to see. We're going to see people get discriminated based on the status of your medical records. I don't know. I stopped myself from saying, getting the woo-woo in the armo. You know what I'm saying? No.
And so as we go into the dazzling 21st century of genetic genies, we hope that as many miracles as possible come our way, but we also ask that Wall Street and these corporations and our society look over their shoulder and make sure that genetics does not return from whence it came. Thank you.
I should mention right now, like he's speaking to a very like empty room, and he's gonna ask any questions. Nobody has any questions. Like for the first, I say he goes into a good amount of chunk of saying stuff before, the first lady asks a question a whole 10 minutes later, because that's how shook these people are. They're just like, whoa, nobody ever taught us this. Nobody ever knew that eugenicism and this whole aspect of trying to cull society and shape it in a very specific way started here in America. Like, nobody knew that if you weren't of any of the races that they deemed worthy, which were primarily, from my understanding, were the English, right? Anybody who was there during the Civil War and anybody who was there during the establishment of the country, I would safely assume were people that didn't suffer at the hand of these eugenicists, right? Because, you're just playing a game of numbers of trying to figure out statistically who are the people that they're trying to say, right? Because these are people who went through the Civil War, lost a bunch of their men. So to them, it's just like, I want things the way they used to be. For all these other foreigners and immigrants came, I don't even know what they would speak like. But you get my point. I get really upset. I actually had to watch this in portions. Because I found it very difficult to watch this. Because I know people currently who are, who took the medical advice from the current events unfolding in the world. And how their health is deteriorating. I don't know. And it just leaves a lot of people feeling in a very weird state of mind, understanding that history taught us, but nobody listened. Nobody learned. I don't know.
Stand up and ask your question.
I should turn this off.
And also, I would ask that because we have limited time, no speeches or commentary. People are quite angry. Does anybody have? IBM was involved in this because, of course, I did my last to give you more information. A lot of people ask whether IBM was involved in this because, of course, I did my last book was IBM and the Holocaust, and I can tell you that IBM was not involved in American eugenics. That's one of the reasons American eugenics did not succeed at the level it sought to succeed. These family tracings and ancestral records were accumulated on Long Island and elsewhere on index cards and plain paper forms. And as a result of that, there were so many millions of forms and cards that by the time the punch cards came into greater use in about the 1920s, there were too many to punch in. And so eugenics in America never achieved the ability to database, to cross-reference all the individuals, because eugenics, remember, wanted to do more than get
Right, they wanted to get rid of families.
rid of the individual. They wanted the entire family, and that was the key. And they could never track the family as they wanted to, simply because they lacked the database and capabilities that.
And IBM, that is why America kind of survived all of the very, very, very crazy influence of woo-woo in trying to shape humanity as a whole, was because IBM didn't develop fast enough. Imagine that. Who knows how bad that could have all been. And it's always this obsession with genetics, and it's always this obsession with blood work and like what's your lineage, this and that. So it's like, what are you hiding? Like, why go to such like infinite degrees of in order for you to satisfy this ideological pursuit
that IBM could give them? By the same token, that's exactly why Nazi eugenics worked in Nazi Germany, because IBM went in there from the beginning and offered to organize the Holocaust, from the identification to the exclusion, to the confiscation, to the ghettoization, to the deportation, to the extermination of the Jews. They organized it in terms of databasing, in terms of systematic file keeping, record keeping, and that's why eugenics worked in Nazi Germany. Now, it's interesting that when I wrote IBM and the Holocaust, I thought that the famous SS race card that IBM developed for Hitler's SS was born in Nazi Germany. Actually, the prototype of this card was developed originally by IBM New York for the Carnegie Institution of Washington in 1928, a half decade before Hitler came to power, as part of the.
Again, I keep forgetting. I switched it to push to talk because there's too much noise. But right, Hitler, the German movement, the Nazis were largely sponsored by American corporations. Because at the end of the day, they're like, yo, this dude across the world, he believes in what we believe in. I think we gotta help him out. I like him. He likes me. I could fund him. I can give him some money. What's the problem with that? Finance a bit of his operation. Get what I need. Either way.
1928 Jamaica race crossing project as the first step along the way to wiping out the existence of all black people on Earth. We should also understand that while most Jewish people and my parents in the Jewish community, my parents who went through it, know that in the ghettos of Europe in the 40s, there would be what they called an action. That means an action. The Nazis would want 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 Jews to kill or to work or to experiment on, and they would just see someone crossing the street and they would grab them. Well, 10 to 20 years before this was going on, they were doing this in Virginia with white people. They were in the back roads of the foothills. The county wagon would cruise up and down. They would see a hillbilly just laying by the side of the road, or maybe fishing or having lunch. They would grab him. They would deem that he was genetically or eugenically unfit.
And listen to why. Listen to why these group of white people were actually targeted. And it actually fits into like one of my ideas of why gingers or people with brown hair, or it's why I don't know if anyone's ever noticed this, but I remember when I was younger, I used to see a lot more people with brownish hair, a lot more people with reddish hair. At least I don't know, I've always noticed it, but now there are much less of them. And this is the only time I've ever heard of an explanation as to why.
They would find out where his cabin was back in the hills and hollers, get the entire family, maybe 10 or 12 people, commit them all to the institution for the feeble-minded, and forcibly sterilize them all. And this, of course, was officially sanctioned by the state of Virginia. Before I go on with more oppressive, shocking information, does anybody have an additional question?
I think I missed it, but I don't know if it's this or later. He'll actually say that it's because they had brownish hair. It's because it did not fit the ideal model of what kind of race that they were trying to get, which is primarily blonde, fair-haired, etc., blue-eyed, da-da-da.
Okay, let's go on further. I'm glad I'm having the opportunity to give you the information. Margaret Sanger was a famous eugenicist. You have to understand, this was not just a movement of a couple of weird guys. This was entrenched national policy. And this was
nobody's actually listening to this
power structure in
Imagine that.
All the presidents of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, Harding, and in the case of Margaret Sanger, there's, of course, a huge controversy as to whether she is a racist or not a racist or anything of that nature, and the documentation shows that Margaret Sanger was not a racist, but she was a bigot. She was not a Nazi or any kind of a Jew hater, but she surrounded herself with the greatest Nazis and Jew haters in the United States. People so virulent, they...
What's that quote, right? Like, show me your friends, I'll show you your future. Well,
they got fan mail from Adolf Hitler. And she did want to save humanity, but only the top 30%. And so terms like human waste and human weeds populated her speeches and her publications as she tried to relieve the teeming masses by ensuring that they stopped teeming. Now, how did I get all this information? Well, I deployed about 50 volunteer and other researchers into some 110 archives and libraries in 4 any of the materials that we have found printed on the subject of eugenics. We have found that almost everything on the internet about eugenics is either all wrong, half wrong, or partially wrong. And it's very important for me to make sure that my information is bulletproof. And so we, of course, have one footnote folder, but behind every footnote, there are some 1,500 in the book, 100 pages of footnotes, and within 30 seconds, we can pull out the written. documentation, original documentation on virtually every footnote. And it's important to understand that many of the individuals who have written about this have done pioneering work, but there are errors, and we have hopefully corrected those errors for the future. My book only begins the sad saga of investigation of eugenics. I've taken you to this dark, frightening house of horrors, but about half the information that I found was never used. Why? Because eugenics, which was an international movement and a national policy, was implemented on an intensely local basis. And so I could have written 50 books. And actually, that would have only been the start. And so now we need many, many more investigative journalists to explore the attics and the closets and the basements and the dark corners of this terrible house of eugenics to discover the additional stories. And maybe after 20, 30, or 40 books, will we begin to understand just the dimensions of this problem. Now, here's the question.
Crazy. I just find myself just... This is my second viewing as of watching it with you guys. But damn. Just damn. Damn, son. Where'd you find this? Found it where I found everything else. Behind people's purview. In a very blind spot where people wouldn't actually think to look.
About the first 75 pages of your book. I'm in the process of reading it now. Were there any well-known figures at the time whose alarm bells went off for them and they were speaking out against this movement? Was there anyone we could point to who said...
Anybody who was prominent or otherwise spoke out against this at the time? And the answer is plenty of people. The majority of Americans. This became public knowledge, of course, because there were public laws passed starting from 1907 and 1909. This became public knowledge. And the Polish people, Jews, Italians, blacks, and Spanish people, they didn't want to see themselves wiped out. They thought this was all wacko, that this was nuts. They couldn't believe that anyone was doing this. And so there was a great deal of public ridicule in the newspapers among the investigative reporters. And consequently, these men persevered in the face of public ridicule. So even as...
I'd be... Well, you know... Meanwhile, now people are just being like, yeah, I'll sign up and sign a waiver.
It isn't that people didn't object. It's that these were the men who had a grasp on the halls of power. Sometimes just one man would go on a personal crusade to lobby an entire legislature and enable legislation to persecute and discriminate against so many different types of people. You know, this is what it's important to understand.
Only one person. That's all it really took.
That if you're willing to get rid of one ethnic group, one minority, you're willing to get rid of them all. And that is why I'm delighted that this book has resonated not only with Jews, but with blacks, with Hispanics, with Asians, and all people who have an understanding that once one man sets himself up as the biological tribunal as to who can live and who cannot live, we are facing a potential for genocide. Is there another question? This gentleman here.
And that's where I'm gonna leave it. Because I get really, really upset at thinking about the fact that I knew a lot of people that I called friends that just really dug themselves in these ideologue paradigms because they saw it was the easiest answer for them to get to. But I looked at them and I'm like, but you're the one suffering the most from this. Like you're at the behest of these people the most. Like when it's pharmaceutical companies and the pharmaceutical drug companies and primarily the families that it destroyed, it was primarily them. When you look at what the propaganda is primarily affecting in terms of cable television, it was them. When you look at who's been largely the shaper of, well, not the shaper, but the helper of the shaper of the reality, was who? Was them. And they all do it, you know, with good intention because they don't necessarily know what they're doing, but they're there helping the malicious hand that's destroying them. And it hurts. It hurts every time I actually think about it because, you know, I don't know, some people would be like, oh, you don't have to care, man. They're just going to do it to themselves, man. There's nothing you do. I don't know. It still hurts to me, I guess. Either way, thanks for watching. I'm Ramirez. We did a live stream yesterday at the Rabbit Hole Network. Watch that at therabbithole.show. Or you could type in Rabbit Hole Network on YouTube. I'm frogbear.zil. Rami, Ramirez, whatevers. Probably do another one of these because I am doing daily streaming now. Because I need to crack that algorithm like I